The golden light of the setting sun painted the jagged silhouette of the Colorado Rockies as Lillian Vaughn's desperate screams shattered the evening calm of St. Elmo. Pain unlike anything she had ever known tore through her body, followed by an eerie silence that would haunt her dreams for months to come. It was April 15, 1883, and in that moment, everything she had hoped for vanished like morning mist in the unforgiving mountain air. 3 days later, Lillian sat motionless beside the empty wooden cradle her husband Thomas had crafted with such care during the long winter months. Her fingers traced the smooth edges, polished to perfection, now vacant of the precious life they had anticipated for so long. The tiny blankets her mother had sent from back east remained folded neatly, unused. The small knitted cap would never warm the head of her stillborn son. "Mrs. Vaughn," a soft knock accompanied the hesitant voice. "Mrs. Vaughn, I've brought some stew. You need to eat something." Lillian didn't respond. She hadn't eaten since the birth, hadn't slept more than fitful moments. Her once vibrant auburn hair hung limp around her hollow face, and her green eyes, usually bright with mischief and determination, stared vacantly at the cradle. Mrs. Peterson, the midwife who had been present during the birth, pushed open the door with her hip, balancing a tray of food. At 58, she had witnessed many tragedies in the mining town, but the loss of the Vaughn baby had affected her deeply. The child had been perfectly formed, beautiful even, but had never drawn breath. "The mining company sent word," Mrs. Peterson said, setting the tray on a small table. "Your husband's party will be delayed another week." The spring thaw caused a rockslide that's blocked their return from the new claim. Lillian didn't acknowledge the words. Thomas had left 6 weeks earlier with several other men from town to stake claims in a newly discovered silver vein. The timing couldn't have been worse, but they needed the money desperately. Her hand moved to her flat stomach, a cruel reminder of what should have been. "Child, you must eat." Mrs. Peterson's voice grew firmer. "Thomas will need you strong when he returns." "He won't have anyone to return to," Lillian whispered, her voice rough from days of crying and silence. "Our son is gone, our hope is gone." Mrs. Peterson sighed heavily. "I'll send word to the pastor." "Perhaps he can. The pastor buried our baby yesterday while I was too weak to stand," Lillian interrupted, a flash of anger breaking through her grief. "I don't need prayers, I need my child." The older woman hesitated, then nodded. "I'll come back this evening to check on you." After the midwife left, Lillian rose shakily to her feet. Her body still ached from the difficult birth, a constant physical reminder of her loss. She moved to the window and stared out at the bustling main street of St. Elmo. The mining town had grown rapidly in the past few years, with the discovery of silver bringing hopeful prospectors from all directions. She and Thomas had arrived 2 years earlier, full of dreams for their future. Now those dreams lay buried in the small cemetery on the hill. A commotion in the street drew her attention. A group of riders was approaching, dust rising behind their horses. Not Thomas's party, these men were coming from the opposite direction. Lillian watched dispassionately as they dismounted in front of the general store across the street. 5 men, trail-worn and dusty, led by a tall figure in a battered hat. She was about to turn away when one of the men glanced up at her window. Even from this distance, his piercing blue eyes seemed to connect with hers. He paused, hat in hand, and gave a respectful nod before following his companions into the store. Lillian returned to the cradle, running her hands over the smooth wooden rails. Thomas had worked on it every evening by lamplight through the winter, his strong hands carefully shaping each piece. "It needs to be perfect," he had said, smiling as he placed his hand on her growing belly. "Nothing but the best for our little one." Now it stood empty, a monument to shattered hopes. The shadows lengthened as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Lillian didn't light a lamp. The darkness suited her mood, matching the emptiness inside her. When another knock came at her door, she ignored it, assuming Mrs. Peterson had returned with more unwanted food and advice. Instead, a deep, unfamiliar voice called through the door. "Mrs. Vaughn, Zachary Coleman, madam." "I'm working for the Postal Express. I've got a telegram from your husband." Lillian rose quickly, ignoring the dizziness that accompanied the sudden movement. She opened the door to find the blue-eyed stranger from earlier standing on her porch, hat in hand. He was taller than she had realized, broad-shouldered and lean, with the weathered look of a man who spent his days outdoors. "Thomas sent a telegram," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, madam." He held out an envelope. "I volunteered to deliver it personally when I heard about your situation. I'm mighty sorry for your loss." Lillian took the envelope with trembling fingers, noticing the gentleness in the man's expression. Not pity, which she had seen too much of lately, but a genuine compassion that momentarily pierced her numbness. "Thank you, Mr. Coleman," she said, stepping back to close the door. "Madam," he said, hesitating, "forgive me for being forward, but is there anything you need?" "Any help I might provide while your husband's delayed?" "Nothing can help me now," Lillian replied, the words escaping before she could stop them. Coleman nodded, his expression solemn. "Even so, I'll be staying at the boarding house for a few days. If you change your mind, just send word." After he left, Lillian opened the telegram with shaking hands. Thomas's message was brief. "Delayed 2 more weeks, stop claim promising, stop sorry about baby, stop keep strong, stop love Thomas." The paper fluttered to the floor as Lillian collapsed beside the cradle, fresh tears streaming down her face. Sorry about the baby. As if their son had been a mining venture that hadn't panned out. As if a few words could encompass the devastating loss of their child. In the darkening room, she wept until exhaustion finally claimed her, slumped against the empty cradle that held only dreams. Dawn brought unwelcome light streaming through the windows Lillian had neglected to cover. She awoke stiff and sore on the floor, her eyes swollen from crying. The empty cradle loomed beside her, a permanent reminder of what should have been. A gentle knock at the door roused her from her stupor. Too weak to protest, she called, "Come in," expecting Mrs. Peterson. Instead, Zachary Coleman entered, carrying a tray of food. The scent of fresh bread and coffee filled the small house. "I hope you don't mind, madam," he said, setting the tray on the table. "Mrs. Peterson mentioned you haven't been eating. Thought maybe a different face might help." Lillian stared at him, taking in his clean-shaven face and freshly washed clothes. Without the dust of the trail, he was handsome in a rugged way, with those striking blue eyes and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. "I'm not hungry," she said automatically, though her stomach betrayed her with a loud growl. A small smile touched his lips. "Maybe your body disagrees, madam." Something about his quiet confidence broke through her resistance. Lillian slowly rose and moved to the table, sitting down heavily in the wooden chair. She picked up the coffee cup with both hands, letting the warmth seep into her cold fingers. "Why are you helping me, Mr. Coleman?" she asked after taking a small sip. "You don't know me." Zachary removed his hat and set it on the table. "I was raised to help folks in need, and right now you need someone to make sure you eat." "I lost my baby," she said flatly, as if testing his reaction. His expression remained steady. "I know, madam, that's a grief beyond words, but starving yourself won't bring him back." The simple truth of his statement hit her harder than all the platitudes and prayers she'd heard over the past days. Lillian broke off a piece of bread and placed it in her mouth, chewing mechanically. "My sister lost 2 babies before they were born," Zachary continued, his voice gentle. "She thought she'd never smile again. Now she has 3 healthy children." Lillian's hands trembled. "Did you say that to give me hope?" "I said it because it's true. There can be more tomorrows, Mrs. Vaughn, different than you planned, but still worth living for." She ate in silence after that, surprised by her own hunger once she began. Zachary sat quietly, his presence oddly comforting. When she finished, he stood and collected the tray. "I'll be back this evening with supper, if that's all right," he said. Lillian found herself nodding, though she wasn't sure why. After he left, she moved to the window and watched him cross the street, his tall figure moving with an easy grace. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of something other than despair, curiosity about this kind stranger who seemed determined to keep her alive. True to his word, Zachary returned that evening with a hearty stew from the boarding house kitchen. This time he stayed longer, telling her stories of his travels as a courier for the Postal Express. His deep voice filled the small house, creating a buffer against the silence that had become her constant companion. "How long have you been married, Mrs. Vaughn?" he asked as she finished eating. 3 years, Lillian replied. "Thomas and I came west from Pennsylvania after the steel mill where he worked closed down. We heard about the silver strikes and decided to take a chance." "And you, did you want to come west?" The question surprised her. Few had ever asked what she wanted. "I was scared," she admitted, "but also excited. I'd never been further than Pittsburgh before. The idea of mountains and open spaces appealed to me. And now," Lillian's gaze drifted to the empty cradle. "Now I wonder if we made a mistake. If we'd stayed east, maybe better doctors." "Or maybe nothing would have changed," Zachary said gently. "Some things aren't for us to understand." "That's what the pastor said at the burial," Lillian said bitterly. "God's mysterious ways. I find no comfort in mystery, Mr. Coleman." Zachary didn't respond immediately. When he did, his words surprised her. "Neither do I, Mrs. Vaughn. I find comfort in action, in doing what needs to be done today and leaving tomorrow's worries for tomorrow." Their eyes met across the table, and for a moment, Lillian felt understood in a way she hadn't since the birth. This stranger somehow grasped her practical nature, her frustration with platitudes that offered no real solace. "Will you come again tomorrow?" she asked impulsively as he prepared to leave. His smile was warm. "I'll bring breakfast." Over the next days, Zachary became a steady presence in Lillian's life. Each morning he arrived with breakfast, often staying to help with small repairs around the house that Thomas had left undone. In the evenings, he brought dinner and conversation, gradually drawing Lillian out of her shell of grief. She learned he was 32, born in Missouri but raised in various territories as his father sought better opportunities. He'd been a cowhand, a scout, and briefly a deputy sheriff before finding his niche with the Postal Express, carrying important messages and packages to remote settlements. "It suits me," he explained as they sat on her porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. "I'm not much for staying in one place too long. Don't you get lonely?" Lillian asked, surprising herself with the personal question. Zachary considered this, his blue eyes reflecting the fading light. "Sometimes, but there's something to be said for freedom." "Freedom," she echoed, the word tasting strange on her tongue. As a woman, first a daughter and then a wife, freedom had never been something she'd experienced. Every step of her life had been determined by the men around her father, husband, now even this kind stranger who had appointed himself her caretaker. "You're thinking mighty hard, Mrs. Vaughn," Zachary observed, a slight smile playing at his lips. "Lillian," she said suddenly, "if you're going to continue bringing me meals and fixing my porch steps, you might as well use my name." His smile widened. "Lillian then, and I'm Zach to my friends." Friends, the word hung between them, filled with potential. Lillian realized with surprise that she did consider this man a friend, perhaps her only one in St. Elmo. The women in town had always kept a certain distance. She was too educated, too opinionated for their tastes. And now, marked by tragedy, they avoided her as if misfortune might be catching. But Zach sought her out, seemed to enjoy her company. For the first time in weeks, she felt like more than just a vessel of grief. The next morning, Lillian awoke before dawn. Instead of lying in bed dwelling on her loss, she rose and dressed carefully, even pinning up her hair properly. When Zach knocked with breakfast, she was already preparing coffee. His surprise was evident. "You're up early." "I thought I might walk to the cemetery today," she said, pouring him a cup of coffee. Would you accompany me?" Something flickered in his eyes, concern, perhaps, or admiration. "Of course." The walk to the small hillside cemetery was silent. Morning mist still clung to the ground, giving the world an ethereal quality. Lillian carried a small bunch of wildflowers she had gathered from beside the path. The grave was tiny, marked with a simple wooden cross. Thomas hadn't been present to arrange for a proper headstone. Pastor Miller had written Baby Vaughn in careful letters on the cross, adding the date of birth and death the same day, April 15, 1883. Lillian knelt beside the grave, placing the flowers against the cross. Tears filled her eyes, but they were quieter now, less desperate than before. "I never even got to hold him," she whispered. "He was already gone when they finally got him out, Mrs." Peterson wouldn't let me see him at first, but I insisted. He was so perfect, Zach. Tiny fingers, tiny toes. He looked like he was sleeping. Zach knelt beside her, his large hand covering hers where it rested on the fresh earth. What was his name to be? William, Lillian said softly. After my father. Thomas wanted to call him Billy, but I preferred Will. Her voice broke. Now he'll never be called anything at all. William Vaughn, Zach said solemnly. A fine name for a fine boy who was loved before he ever drew breath. His simple words unleashed a fresh wave of grief, but it was different now, cleaner somehow, less suffocating. Lillian wept openly, and Zach's arm came around her shoulders, strong and steady, anchoring her in the storm of emotion. When she finally quieted, he helped her to her feet. It's good to cry, Lillian. It's part of healing. She nodded, unable to speak, grateful for his understanding. As they walked back toward town, his hand occasionally brushing hers, Lillian realized she had taken her first step toward living again. The days fell into a pattern. Zach would come in the morning, often with news from town or stories from his travels. Lillian began taking more interest in her appearance and her home, cleaning and cooking again. Sometimes they would walk together in the afternoon, Lillian gradually regaining her strength. One evening, a week after their visit to the cemetery, Zach arrived looking troubled. He set the food on the table without his usual cheerful comment. "What's wrong?" Lillian asked, sensing his disquiet. He removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "I received new orders today. I'm to head to Leadville tomorrow with important documents for the mining company headquarters." "Oh," the single syllable couldn't contain her disappointment. "How long will you be gone?" "That's just it," Zach said, meeting her eyes directly. "It's not just a delivery. They want me to take a position there, coordinating messages between the mining operations. It would mean staying in one place." "Isn't that what you've always avoided?" Lillian asked, trying to understand his concern. He nodded slowly. "It is, but it's also a good opportunity. More money, less danger than riding between settlements." Lillian busied herself setting the table, afraid her expression might reveal too much. The thought of Zach leaving permanently created an unexpected hollow feeling in her chest. "You should take it," she said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "It sounds like a good position." "Lillian," Zach said softly, stepping closer. "I've been thinking about it all day. The job itself appeals to me, but leaving St. Elmo." He paused, then continued more hesitantly, "Leaving you doesn't sit right." She looked up quickly, her heart racing at his words. Zach, the door burst open, cutting off her response. A tall man with a beard streaked with dust stood in the doorway, his expression shifting rapidly from joy to confusion at the scene before him. "Thomas?" Lillian gasped, stunned by her husband's unexpected appearance. Thomas Vaughn's gaze darted between his wife and Zach, taking in the intimate tableau, the set table, the two of them standing close together, the evident comfort between them. "I see you've had company while I've been gone," he said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. Lillian moved quickly to her husband's side. "Thomas, this is Zachary Coleman. He works for the Postal Express. He's been kind enough to check on me after what happened." Thomas's expression softened slightly as he looked at his wife, noticing the traces of grief still evident in her face despite her improved appearance. He set down his pack and embraced her awkwardly. "I'm sorry I wasn't here, Lil," he murmured against her hair. "The telegram didn't say much, just that we lost the baby." Zach had retreated to the edge of the room, retrieving his hat. "I should go," he said quietly. "Welcome home, Mr. Vaughn." "Mr. Coleman," Thomas acknowledged with a stiff nod. "I appreciate you looking after my wife in my absence." After Zach left, an uncomfortable silence filled the small house. Thomas moved around restlessly, as if seeing the space with new eyes. "The cradle," he said finally, spotting it in the corner. "You kept it out," Lillian nodded. "I couldn't bear to put it away, not yet." Thomas approached it slowly, running his calloused hand over the wood he had shaped with such care. "Was it a boy or a girl?" "A boy," Lillian whispered. "I named him William." Her husband's shoulders slumped. "William, a good name." He turned to face her, his expression haunted. "I should have been here, Lil. I'm so sorry." "There was nothing you could have done," she said, the words automatic though part of her had indeed resented his absence. Tell me what happened, he requested, sinking into a chair at the table. Lillian recounted the difficult birth, the terrible silence afterward, the small funeral. Thomas listened with his head bowed, occasionally wiping at his eyes. When she mentioned Zach's arrival with the telegram and his subsequent kindness, her husband's expression grew guarded again. He seems to have made himself quite at home, Thomas observed. Lillian felt a flash of defensive anger. He was here when I needed someone, Thomas. When I was ready to give up entirely, he made sure I ate, made sure I kept going. Thomas had the grace to look ashamed. You're right. I'm grateful for that. He reached for her hand across the table. I missed you terribly, Lil, but the claim is good better than good. We'll be able to buy proper land, build a real house. And, he hesitated, then pushed forward, we can try again for another baby. Lillian withdrew her hand, a chill running through her. I can't think about that yet. Of course, Thomas said quickly. It's too soon, I understand. But as they prepared for bed that night, Lillian wasn't sure he did understand. Thomas spoke enthusiastically of the future, of his plans for their prosperity, hardly mentioning their loss. It was as if he had grieved during his time away and was ready to move forward while she was still caught in the aftermath of tragedy. As Thomas slept beside her, Lillian lay awake, her thoughts turning to Zach. What had he been about to say before Thomas arrived, and why did the thought of him leaving for Leadville create such an ache inside her? The next morning, Thomas rose early, eager to deposit his earnings in the bank and speak with the assayer about samples he had brought back. Lillian prepared breakfast mechanically, her mind elsewhere. I'll be back for dinner, Thomas said, kissing her cheek. Maybe we could visit the cemetery together afterward. I'd like to pay my respects to our son. Lillian nodded, touched by his consideration. I'd like that. After Thomas left, she stood at the window, watching the town come to life. Would Zach come to say goodbye before leaving for Leadville? Part of her hoped so, while another part feared what might be said. Her question was answered shortly before noon when a knock came at the door. Zach stood on the porch, dressed for travel, his horse visible at the hitching post. I'm leaving for Leadville, he said without preamble. I wanted to say goodbye properly. Lillian stepped outside, closing the door behind her. Standing on the porch, they were hidden from the main street's view by the overhanging roof. I'm glad you came, she said softly. I wanted to thank you for everything you've done. Zach's blue eyes studied her face intently. Are you all right? With Thomas home now, the question carried layers of meaning. Lillian considered her answer carefully. He's trying. It's different for him. He wasn't here for the worst of it. And the job offer? Zach asked. Before he arrived, I was going to ask if you would consider, he stopped, shaking his head. It doesn't matter now. It matters to me, Lillian said, surprising herself with her boldness. What were you going to ask? Zach stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. I was going to ask if you would consider coming to Leadville with me. Not right away, but sometime when you were ready. Lillian's breath caught. The implication was clear. He was offering her a different future, away from the memories that haunted her in St. Elmo. I can't, she said, the words painful in her throat. Thomas is my husband. He needs me now, just as I needed someone when he was gone. Zach nodded, his expression solemn. I understand. I wouldn't have spoken at all if I hadn't seen something in you, Lillian, a strength you perhaps don't recognize yet. You deserve happiness, whatever form that takes. He reached out slowly, giving her time to step away if she wished, and touched her cheek gently. If you ever need me for any reason, send word to the postal office in Leadville. I'll come. Lillian closed her eyes briefly, leaning into his touch. Thank you for showing me there could be more tomorrows. I won't forget that. Zach's hand fell away. He stepped back, replacing his hat. Goodbye, Lillian Vaughn. She watched him ride away, a tall figure against the backdrop of mountains, until he disappeared around a bend in the road. Only then did she allow the tears to fall, mourning not just her lost child but a possibility she had never anticipated. The following weeks settled into an uneasy rhythm. Thomas threw himself into preparing their future, using his earnings from the claim to purchase 10 acres of land on the outskirts of town. He spoke constantly of the house he would build, the livestock they would raise, the children they would have. Lillian tried to match his enthusiasm, but found herself increasingly withdrawn. The empty cradle remained in the corner of their small rented house, a silent reminder of what they had lost. At night, when Thomas reached for her with obvious intent, she turned away, claiming fatigue or lingering pain from the birth. "The doctor says I'm fully healed," she overheard Thomas telling a friend outside the general store one afternoon. "But she won't let me near her. It's like living with a ghost." The words stung, but Lillian recognized their truth. Part of her remained in that terrible day, holding her stillborn son. Another part had left with Zach, riding toward a future she would never know. One evening in late May, Thomas returned home with a strange expression on his face. He handed Lillian an envelope without comment. "What's this?" she asked, turning it over in her hands. "A letter for you from Leadville." Lillian's heart raced as she recognized Zach's handwriting. She set it aside, unable to open it under Thomas's watchful eye. "Aren't you going to read it?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Later," she replied, continuing to prepare their dinner. Thomas sat heavily at the table. "He came by my work site today. You're Mr. Coleman." Lillian nearly dropped the pot she was holding. "He's not my anything, Thomas, and why would he come see you?" "To talk about you," Thomas said bluntly. "And about us." She turned to face her husband, fear and confusion mingling in her chest. "What did he say?" Thomas's expression was unreadable. "He said you'd been through hell and needed patience, said I shouldn't push you to have another baby too soon." He paused, then added, "He also said you were the strongest woman he'd ever met and that I was lucky to have you as my wife." Tears pricked at Lillian's eyes. "Thomas, he's in love with you," Thomas interrupted. "It was plain as day, and I think maybe you have feelings for him too." Lillian sank into the chair opposite her husband. There seemed little point in denial. "He was kind to me when I needed kindness. He listened when I needed to talk. He held me when I cried over our son's grave." Thomas flinched at her words. "All things I should have done." "Yes," Lillian agreed softly, "but you weren't here." They sat in silence, the unspoken truth hanging between them. Finally, Thomas spoke again. "Do you want to go to him? Is that what you're waiting for? Permission?" Lillian shook her head. "No, Thomas. I made vows to you and I intend to keep them." She hesitated, then added, "But I need time. I need to mourn our son properly. I need you to understand what I've been through." Thomas reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Then help me understand, Lil. Talk to me like you talked to him." That night, they sat before the fire long after dinner was finished. Lillian spoke of the birth, of the terrible emptiness afterward, of her darkest thoughts when she contemplated joining her son in death. Thomas listened without interruption, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. When she finally fell silent, exhausted by the outpouring of emotion, Thomas knelt before her chair and laid his head in her lap. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "So sorry for not being here, for not understanding what you've endured." Lillian stroked his hair gently. "And I'm sorry for pushing you away when you returned. We both lost our son, Thomas. We should grieve together, not apart." Later, when they went to bed, Thomas held her close, asking nothing more than her presence in his arms. It was the first peaceful night's sleep Lillian had experienced since losing the baby. The next morning, she finally opened Zach's letter, reading it while Thomas was outside chopping wood. "Dear Lillian," it began. "I hope this letter finds you well and that your husband's return has brought you comfort. I've taken the position in Leadville and find the work satisfying, though I miss our conversations. I wanted you to know that I spoke with Thomas yesterday. I hope you don't mind, but I felt he needed to understand what you've endured. Your marriage deserves a chance to heal, as does your heart. Remember what I told you about my sister. There can be more tomorrows, different than you planned, but still worth living for. You have strength inside you that I recognized from the first moment I saw you at your window. Whatever path you choose, know that someone believes in your courage. With deepest respect, Zachary Coleman." Lillian folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her Bible. Then she went to the cradle and ran her fingers over the smooth wood one last time. With a deep breath, she began to dismantle it, piece by piece. Thomas found her there when he returned, surrounded by the wooden components of what had been their son's bed. "Lil, what are you doing?" he asked, confusion evident in his voice. She looked up at her husband, her eyes clear and determined. "It's time to put this away, Thomas, not to forget, but to make room for healing, for our future." Understanding dawned in his face. He knelt beside her, helping to gather the pieces. "We'll store them carefully," he promised, "and someday, when the time is right, I'll build another." That evening, they walked together to the cemetery. Lillian had fashioned a small wooden marker to replace the temporary cross, carving William Vaughn, beloved son, into its surface. Thomas dug a small hole and they placed the marker together, his arm strong around her shoulders as they stood in silent remembrance. As spring turned to summer, Lillian and Thomas began rebuilding their life together. Construction started on their new house, a sturdy two-bedroom structure with a wide porch overlooking the mountains. Thomas worked tirelessly, determined to create the home he had promised his wife. Lillian found herself spending more time in town, no longer avoiding the pitying glances of neighbors. She even accepted an invitation to help at the schoolhouse, using the education she had received back east to assist the overworked teacher. In July, Thomas suggested a picnic to celebrate the completion of the house's exterior. They rode to a meadow high above St. Elmo, spreading a blanket beneath a solitary pine tree with a view that stretched for miles. "You remember our first picnic?" Thomas asked as they shared bread and cheese. "Back in Pennsylvania before we were married," Lillian smiled at the memory. "You were so nervous you spilled lemonade all over my new dress. And you laughed instead of getting angry," Thomas recalled. "That's when I knew I wanted to marry you." "Is that so?" Lillian teased, feeling lighter than she had in months. "I thought it was my father's threat to shoot you if you didn't make an honest woman of me." Thomas chuckled, then grew serious. "I've been thinking, Lil, about our future." "Oh." She tensed slightly, wondering if he was going to mention children again. "I know you're not ready yet," he said, surprising her with his perception. "And I won't push, but I want you to know that whatever happens, whether we have more children or not, I'm grateful for you, for us." Tears welled in Lillian's eyes. "Thank you for understanding." Thomas took her hand, his expression earnest. "Coleman was right about one thing: you are the strongest woman I've ever known, and I'm the luckiest man to have you as my wife." Lillian squeezed his hand, a sense of peace settling over her. The mention of Zach no longer brought the sharp pang it once had. Instead, she felt gratitude for his brief presence in her life and the wisdom he had shared. As summer faded into autumn, Lillian and Thomas moved into their new home. The second bedroom remained empty, its purpose unspoken between them. Lillian planted a small garden before the first frost, planning for spring blooms. Thomas added a porch swing, remembering how she had always wanted one. In October, a letter arrived from Leadville. Lillian recognized Zach's handwriting immediately, but this time she opened it with Thomas present, reading it aloud to her husband. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Vaughn," it began. "I hope this letter finds you both well. I'm writing with news I thought might interest you. I've been promoted to regional coordinator for the Postal Express, which means I'll be traveling again, establishing new routes and training riders. My first assignment brings me near St. Elmo next month. I would be honored if you would allow me to pay a brief visit. With respect, Zachary Coleman." Thomas and Lillian exchanged a long look. "It's your decision," Thomas said finally. "I trust you, Lil." Lillian considered carefully before responding. "I think we should invite him for dinner. Both of us need to thank him properly for what he did." When Zach arrived in November, the first snow had dusted the mountains. He looked much as Lillian remembered, though perhaps more at ease, his smile coming more readily. Thomas met him at the door with an extended hand, which Zach shook firmly. "Your new home is impressive, Vaughn," Zach commented as they showed him around. "You've accomplished a lot in a short time." "We've been blessed," Thomas replied, glancing at Lillian with obvious affection. "More than I deserve, some might say." Dinner was initially awkward, but the tension eased as they shared news and stories. Zach spoke enthusiastically about his new position, describing the expansion of postal routes throughout the territory. "And you, Mrs. Vaughn?" Zach asked, his blue eyes meeting hers directly for the first time that evening. "How have you been?" Lillian smiled, aware of both men watching her intently. "I've been healing, Mr. Coleman, day by day. I'm teaching at the school now 3 days a week." "She's wonderful with the children," Thomas added proudly. "They adore her." Something passed between the three of them in that moment, an acknowledgement of what had been and what might have been, followed by an acceptance of what was. After dinner, Thomas excused himself to tend to the horses, deliberately giving Lillian a moment alone with their guest. "You look well," Zach said softly when Thomas had gone. "There's color in your cheeks again." "I am well," Lillian confirmed. "Better than I would have been without your kindness last spring." Zach nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And Thomas, he's good to you?" "Very," Lillian said sincerely. "Your talk with him made a difference. He understands now in a way he couldn't before." "I'm glad," Zach said, and she could tell he meant it. "You deserve happiness, Lillian. That's all I ever wanted for you." "What about you?" she asked, suddenly needing to know. "Have you found happiness in your new position?" A small smile played at his lips. "I have, actually. The work suits me and—" He hesitated, then continued, "I've met someone, a widow in Leadville with 2 young children. She reminds me of you in some ways, strong, determined." Lillian felt a brief pang, followed by genuine warmth. "I'm happy for you, Zach, truly." When Thomas returned, the three of them sat before the fire, sharing a bottle of whiskey and conversations about the future. As the evening drew to a close, Zach prepared to return to town, where he was staying at the hotel. At the door, he shook Thomas's hand again, then turned to Lillian. "I kept my promise," he said quietly. "I came when you needed me, and I'll keep mine," she replied. "I won't forget that there are always more tomorrows." After Zach left, Thomas wrapped his arms around Lillian from behind, both of them watching from the window as their visitor rode away. "Are you all right?" Thomas asked, his breath warm against her ear. Lillian turned in his embrace, looking up at her husband's concerned face. "I'm more than all right, Thomas. I'm ready." "Ready for what?" he asked, though his eyes suggested he understood her meaning. She took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "Ready for our future, for the family we've always wanted." That night, for the first time since losing their son, Lillian welcomed her husband's touch without reservation, their bodies remembering the language of love they had nearly forgotten. Winter settled over St. Elmo, blanketing the town in snow and bringing long, quiet evenings by the fire. Lillian and Thomas grew closer than they had been even in the early days of their marriage, finding new depth in their shared grief and recovery. In January, Lillian missed her monthly cycle. She waited 2 more weeks before sharing the news with Thomas, both of them cautiously optimistic but afraid to hope too fully. "We'll take every precaution," Thomas promised, his hands gentle on her still flat stomach. "Whatever you need, whatever the doctor advises." As her pregnancy progressed, Lillian found herself thinking often of Zach's words about his sister. There could indeed be more tomorrows, different than planned but precious nonetheless. She wrote to him in Leadville, sharing their news and receiving warm congratulations in return, along with an announcement of his engagement to the widow he had mentioned. Summer arrived with Lillian's body swelling prominently with new life. The doctor had pronounced both mother and baby healthy, though he insisted on regular checkups given her previous tragedy. Thomas hovered anxiously, completing the nursery but leaving the cradle in storage, sensitive to Lillian's feelings about using it again. Instead, he commissioned a new cradle from the town's best carpenter, incorporating some of the decorative elements from his original design but creating something distinctly different. When it was delivered in August, Lillian ran her hands over the smooth wood, tears in her eyes. "It's perfect," she whispered. "A new cradle for a new beginning." September brought cooling temperatures and increasing discomfort for Lillian as her due date approached. Thomas rarely left her side, arranging for a neighbor to help with his work so he could remain close to home. When her labor began on September 15, 1884, exactly 17 months after they had lost their first child, Lillian faced her fears with quiet determination. Thomas stayed with her throughout, ignoring the midwife's initial protests. "I won't leave her again," he said firmly. "Not this time." The labor was long but uncomplicated. As dawn broke on September 16, Lillian gave a final push and was rewarded with the strong, indignant cry of her newborn daughter. "She's perfect," Mrs. Peterson announced, placing the squalling infant on Lillian's chest. "Healthy as can be." Thomas wept openly as he gazed at his daughter, her tiny face red with the effort of her first cries. She's beautiful, Lil, just like her mother. They named her Hope Elizabeth Vaughn, a testament to the faith that had sustained them through their darkest days. As Lillian nursed her daughter for the first time, she felt a sense of completion that had been missing since the loss of their son. William would have been a wonderful big brother, she murmured, tracing her daughter's delicate features with a gentle finger. He's watching over her, Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. Over all of us. News of Hope's birth spread quickly through St. Elmo. Visitors came bearing gifts and good wishes, many expressing their joy at seeing the Vaughns' happiness after their previous sorrow. Even those who had avoided Lillian during her grief now seemed eager to celebrate this new beginning. A telegram arrived from Leadville 2 days after the birth. Congratulations on your daughter. Stop. May she bring you joy for all your tomorrows. Stop. Zach and Rebecca. As autumn painted the mountains in brilliant gold and crimson, Lillian often sat on the porch swing with Hope cradled in her arms, watching the changing landscape. Thomas would join them when his work was done, his arm around his wife, his face soft with wonder as he gazed at their daughter. Do you ever think about how different things might have been? He asked one evening as the sun set behind the peaks. If I had been here when William was born. Or if Coleman had never come to our door, Lillian considered the question thoughtfully. I think about it sometimes, she admitted. But then I look at Hope, at you, at our life together, and I know we're exactly where we're meant to be. Thomas kissed her temple gently. I love you, Lil. More than I can ever say. Show me, she whispered, leaning into his embrace. Later, with Hope sleeping peacefully in her cradle and the first stars appearing in the night sky, Thomas did just that, his touch conveying all the words that sometimes failed him. As winter approached once more, bringing with it the 1-year anniversary of Zach's visit to their home, Lillian composed a letter to the man who had helped her find her way back to life. Dear Zach and Rebecca, she wrote. As the season changes and we prepare for Hope's first Christmas, I find myself reflecting on the journey that brought us to this point. There are moments in life that alter our path forever, some tragic, some blessed. Meeting you, Zach, was one of those moments for me. You came when I needed strength I couldn't find alone. You showed me that grief, while powerful, need not be all-consuming. You reminded me that there could be more tomorrows. Our daughter grows stronger each day, bringing joy we once thought lost forever. Thomas has proven to be the father I always knew he could be, patient and loving. Our home is filled with laughter again, something I could not have imagined in those dark days after William's birth. We would be honored if you and Rebecca would consider a visit in the spring, perhaps with your new family. Hope should know the man who helped give her life by saving her mother's spirit. With gratitude and affection, Lillian Thomas and Hope Vaughn. She sealed the letter and placed it on the mantel, ready to be posted the next day. Through the window, she could see Thomas returning from town, his tall figure striding purposefully toward the home they had built together. Lillian lifted Hope from her cradle, the baby's weight solid and reassuring in her arms. Together, they went to the door to greet Thomas, stepping out onto the porch into the crisp mountain air. As Thomas approached, his face lighting with joy at the sight of them, Lillian felt a sense of peace settle over her. The path that had brought them here had been marked with both sorrow and unexpected grace, with loss and renewal, with endings and beginnings. She thought of the empty cradle that had once seemed to symbolize all she had lost, and of the man who had held her in her grief, promising more tomorrows. Those tomorrows had come different than she had imagined, perhaps, but no less precious for the journey that had shaped them. Thomas bounded up the steps, enfolding both wife and daughter in his embrace. Over his shoulder, Lillian gazed at the mountains that had witnessed their story, solid and enduring against the vast Colorado sky. Welcome home, she said softly, to her husband and to herself, knowing at last that home was not just a place but a feeling of belonging, of forgiveness, of love that had weathered the storm and emerged stronger for the test. As the first snowflakes began to fall, the Vaughn family stepped inside, closing the door on yesterday's sorrows and opening their hearts to all the tomorrows that awaited them, days filled with hope, in every sense of the word.